I can tell you that Tony Gosling, the former BBC journalist, and the man behind not the BCFM politics show in Bristol, Fridays at 5 o'clock, is now on the line. Good evening, Tony. How are you?
Yes, not too bad. Just arrived back in the car. Had a bit of an altercation in Costa, but let's not go into that.
Do, for Jesus' sake. You had an altercation in Costa.
Well, I had to go to the loo, basically, before I came to see you, and they said I was not expecting to have a bloody, excuse my language, obstacle course to get into the toilet and out again, but it took me about 10 minutes to get into the loo in Costa. And they'd given me as I was trying to use the loo, there's a code apparently now, so I couldn't get into the toilet. I said, I can't get into the toilet. So, we've got a thing on your receipt. And I said, well, my wife's left, and I don't have a receipt. And so they gave me a receipt, and I spent a frantic I'm thinking to myself, look, Richie's waiting. I'm punching these things into the keypad. Nothing's working. Richie had to come and let me in a very grumpy fashion. So I will be boycotting Costa. It's just
This is interesting now. So accessing the toilet, you have a QR code or a barcode on your receipt.
No, it's not a barcode. No, it's just a number. It's like, it was Q. I can tell you what it is for Chippenham if you want.
This is crazy.
Q. Anyway, I mean, it's a number and then a letter and a few numbers, and it just didn't work at all. But anyway,
so presumably,
not them.
No, they want the toilets reserved exclusively for Costa Coffee customers. That's crazy. Anyway, welcome back, pal. It's been more than a few weeks since you were on.
I was a customer, Anyway, look, I mean, it's just really it was fascistic. I felt these people are fascists.
Fascist,
I'm
Tony.
not coming into this damn shop again because they're saying not only can, there's some sort of rigmarole that it takes 10 minutes if you want to use the loo. So no, I'm not going in there.
Good man. I'm boycotting Costa with you. I don't drink coffee in any case. Look, we normally have spoken sooner. It's been more than a while since you were last on. I was intrigued when you sent me a WhatsApp the other day and said you'd like to get into one or two solutions. That's fantastic. Let's put a pin in that for 15 minutes and we will talk about solutions. But I've got to ask you about your old friend, King Charles the Third. You've got to pronounce the TH there. Don't call the monarch a turd, whatever you do. Listen, he didn't attend Maundy Thursday service in Worcester today. Didn't sound great in the message he put out. His daughter-in-law looked and sounded awful in the message she put out. Finally, after all the speculation about where was she, is there something going on? Something maybe a bit not sinister, but is there something going on within the corridors of Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace that they do not want us to know about? Are these people possibly really unwell?
I think the Queen was a moderating influence on a lot of this stuff. I think she was a kind of normal person that found herself in the role, and I don't think she was in any way wicked or, scheming or devious, and it suited the mood of the country after the Second World War. And that's why I think there were so many people lining the streets, etc., to see her coffin go to Windsor on the M4. I remember seeing the film of it. Lots and lots of people came out and they felt this is the end of an era. Well, they're right. So we've now got, who was it? This is a question for you, Richie. Do you know who it was that wrote the PR strategy for the royal family? When?
Now or previously?
Well, in the noughties.
Oh, haven't a clue, T. Haven't a clue.
It's Jimmy Savile.
Give over.
I'm not kidding you either. The PR strategy documents were handwritten by Jimmy Savile for the royal family, which Prince Charles, now King Charles, accepted and brought in to. So this is, I think, what we're dealing with when we're dealing with the royals. So it's all smoke and mirrors. A lot of it is smoke and mirrors. I find it really irritating and disgusting to hear the Queen, because this Camilla is completely like the opposite of the old Queen. She's, I would say, the witch Queen. I would use that sort of expression to describe her. Now, you've also heard me talking about Tim Cohen and his contention that Prince Charles, now King Charles, was the Antichrist. And this is through his biblical interpretation, his book, The Antichrist and a Cup of Tea, which I wouldn't necessarily go along with. But
no, of course not, but it's funny.
666 and the Witch Queen. Well, I mean, the thing is, with King Charles, Cohen goes into some fascinating details about him. One of the things is he is supposed to be of the line of David. He says he is. I don't think he probably is at all, but that's what he says. And this is something which is necessary for the Messiah. And so a kind of Jewish Messiah, I suppose. That's what we're talking about here. And then also he is has some sort of honorary position in the University of Cairo as a professor of Islam. So the idea is he's a sort of peacemaker.
Charles does. Hang on. Charles has an honorary role at a Cairo uni as some sort of, not lecturer, but professor of Islam. You're kidding me.
Of Islam, yeah. Oh, I'm not kidding you, no. Anyway, look, I mean, this is all, if people are interested in following this up, Tim Cohen's website and his interviews explains it in great detail. But, I mean, I just find it horrible when they talk about the Queen. I think of the Queen.
You love the Queen, Tony. I can't understand that. I can't. Look, just for balance, and I'm not going to say it again because I don't insult my guests. I couldn't stand the Queen. I'm not going to say it again, so on you go. Well, I'm an Irish Republican. How could I possibly stand? But just before you regale us with tales of the Queen's virtue, let me ask you this.
Well,
let me ask you this.
I wouldn't go that far.
But Charles must be. Look, he's, I don't mean exterior. I mean, this is one of the ugliest characters of the 20th and 21st century. But it's not unreasonable to think he was mentored by, I mean, the IRA knew Mountbatten was a paedophile. He was a filthy child molester. And this guy hung around Charles, didn't he? So Charles might very well have been subjected to the most unimaginable horrors when he was a boy. Is that fair?
He was Charles's mentor, yeah. So obviously there are extreme concerns that Mountbatten was molesting him when he was a kid, sexually abusing him. So, maybe initiating him into a certain, elite cult type organization or, at least into a mindset. But, I think Charles finds, I mean, one of the things you can definitely detect in his voice, at least for the last 4 or 5 years, is, since back to when he was still Prince, was, he finds the whole sort of public engagement thing very tiresome. So he likes all of the prestige and the power, appointing judges, appointing military officers, appointing cabinet, ministers, etc., that he gets through, being king, but he finds the whole engaging with the public rather boring and tiresome. So this whole business of I've got cancer is extremely convenient for him. He just doesn't have to bother with all this stuff like dishing out money to the poor, things like that, which is what's happening today, Maundy Thursday at Worcester Cathedral. So this is all extremely convenient. It's also a way of trying to garner sympathy, of course, if it's true. So I think I do feel within my rights. I don't like evilizing anybody, but I think I'm within my rights really to say I'm sceptical about almost everything that comes out of the palace. When it comes to Kate, I have more sympathy for her. I think she's found herself in, as a bit like Diana, marrying into this family, the firm, which is deeply dark and sinister. And I look at her, just literally just reading her face. It's almost as if she's looking from side to side, wondering, God Almighty, what they're going to throw at me next, So she's done her job delivering the little uns, and I have quite a bit of sympathy for her being in that sort of situation.
But
so
she hung around.
I'm really not sure.
Sorry, T. She hung around. She was around William long enough before they became engaged, so she would have had a bit of an exclusive window onto that world, which we speculate about it, but she had a real glimpse at it. So why the hell did you accept his proposal and marry him then? I mean, if you spend, I know people who briefly met, and some people who, these are not journalists now, these are people who work in companies in London, who met the Duke of Edinburgh, Philip, and they said they'd never met a darker, more awful, more despicable, lack of courtesy, horrible human being. I mean, she must have known this just by being around them. Andrew, look at the state of these people, T. You don't need to be, so why would you marry him then? I don't understand that.
How many women and men have married for money?
She has money
and
though.
Prestige,
and her family has money.
And everything that goes with that, fame and fortune. This is, of course, it's going to be tempting, and also maybe William's personality has changed. I don't know. I just find it very difficult to see the family as a kind of collection of freaks, where they have to bring in people from outside, usually women, in order to sort of refresh the bloodline. And, they're quite good at conning people. I mean, obviously, King Charles is extremely good. He's conning the entire world into believing in net zero. And he's sitting in the background with his little company that runs the carbon credit system and hopes that nobody notices. So, that I think is, I just don't want to, I do see them as still human beings and maybe even redeemable, some of them.
Now, we'll leave it with the couple of comments. My great friend, Jean Ann Crowley, she won't like this. Jean Ann can sometimes be a bit of a West Brit. We reserve the term or the moniker West Brit for people who have a bit of sympathy with the old Queen, Queen Elizabeth. So Jean Ann would have a bit of sympathy with Queen Elizabeth. I have already said that I wouldn't. But she asks a good question. Because of the photographic evidence we have, and this is not now rampant anti-Semitism or anything else, but it's a fact that the Rothschilds have been intimately acquainted with the British royal family as much as any other royal family over the decades. So would the Rothschilds have had more influence over Charles than Savile, even though Savile was certainly in the inner circle? What about, we've that famous photograph, Tony, haven't we? He's dead now, your man, sticking his finger into Charles's chest. So what about the Rothschild influence over the royal family?
Well, it's a good question. I think the elite have got different aspects to them. Obviously, royal power is very important, aristocratic power. And I think through the orders of knighthood of Europe, if you really want to look at the way that they organise, I think that's what they do. I mean, you look at the Knights of Malta, the Order of the Garter, the Teutonic Knights, the I think still existing system of the Holy Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Emperor. Amongst the aristocracy, this was traditionally the way that Europe was run. And you would be the Holy Roman Emperor, and you would then tell the other aristocrats around Europe who was going to be at war with whom, and fight like that. But so there's that side of things. There's also finance, obviously, is massively important. We're now seeing the whole of Britain basically being brought to its knees by the Tory, Lib Dem, and now just the Tory successful attempt to just take away finance from local government. This, by the way, is exactly what the Poroshenko government did in Ukraine when they kicked out the pro-Russian people, is they stopped funding local government all around the regions in Ukraine. The same thing is happening in Britain. So you're seeing local authorities going bankrupt, services zero. So you're paying your council tax, but you're getting nothing from it. And you're having to pay for the services that you would say, for example, rubbish collection. They used to do in Bristol a free thing where they take bulk rubbish, so you don't just dump it somewhere. Now, no, you've got to pay for it. So that I think is how the finance comes in. But when it comes to direct relationships, look at the Bullingdon Club with Boris Johnson and Nat Rothschild all sitting together in there, along with this now guy, I can't remember his name. He's the foreign minister of Poland. This is how they run things. They're all mates of mates, and they cook up their silly little schemes for more and more power, totally unaccountable and unelected. I mean, amazing to see Cameron now as Foreign Secretary.
I know, sitting in the House of Lords.
He's the guy.
Yeah.
Well, he's the guy behind the destruction of Libya, where you've now got slave markets, human slave markets in Libya. Well done, David. So you're our ambassador to the world.
When we say, Tony, when we say he's behind it, look, he was the Prime Minister of the day as Obama was the President. But really, they're carrying on somebody else's agenda, aren't they? But can I take you back to something? Because you said something very profound, not for the first time, on the Richie Allen show. You talked about them defunding local authorities, and you are right. But listening to Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, and for our uneducated listeners, and we don't have too many of them, Starmer is the leader of the opposition and Rayner is the deputy leader of the opposition. Now, they said today, and I've friends who come on this program, people you know very well. They said today that when they get in, they're basically going to open up a program of devolution, the likes of which we've never seen before. They are going to give more authority, right?
Yeah,
to local
this is what Blair did.
Yes.
Blair did when he came to power, almost unnoticed, was start this process of having the Welsh and Scottish Parliaments giving more and more power to them, getting them going. And maybe people have noticed, maybe they haven't, that the election system for the mayors began as a proper proportional system. Now it's being turned over to a first past the post system to denude democracy. So these people are just playing games with us, really, as far as I can see. And all of the tax take seems to be now going, almost all of it anyway, towards repaying debt. So you've just got a debt trap that these governments have been pushed into. And of course, this is all, the Rothschilds, by the way, are intimately linked to Israel and the creation of the Balfour Declaration, the Zionist state, etc. So that gives a whole nother dimension to their influence. But yes, I think they are.
Can I go back, Tony?
I've done some stuff on Victor Rothschild, who's, I think, one of the most fascinating of all the Rothschilds, who was most definitely involved. He was around in the Second World War and died, I think it was 1990. Very, very influential on the Heath government, very influential on the Thatcher government, and also on the Wilson government. He was a Labour peer. And he was working for MI5, MI6, and also spying for the Russians. So the Rothschilds have been right at the centre of politics. My article I did when Margaret Thatcher died, which has got I think quite a useful, for some people anyway, a timeline of privatisation, which goes through all of the privatisations that happened in the Thatcher era. And I call it Margaret Thatcher and the Man in the Shadows. Victor Rothschild was behind almost everything, including the poll tax, by the way. So the family's immensely influential, both in financial circles with I imagine, your Larry Finks, the BlackRocks and the Vanguards, very, very important. I mean, who are their main shareholders? Well, we're not allowed to know. It's a private business. So yes, they're immensely politically and financially, and possibly, of course, with Israel, and the Jewish state, spiritually influential. They seem to be everywhere.
They seem to be everywhere. Excellent work on Victor Rothschild. And he, if my memory serves, he was very, very influential in turning Edward Heath's head towards the European economic community in the early 70s, wasn't he? He was hugely, and I read some brilliant books over the years.
Through blackmail? Maybe through blackmail.
Through blackmail, yeah. And I read some amazing books over, no doubt blackmail. I mean, it's fairly well established that Heath was a paedophile, and that children were abused by Heath and others on his yacht the morning.
I would say, actually, just to put the record straight, I think it was young men. So we're talking about boys, really.
Boys.
Sort of 13, 14-year-olds. That's what I've heard from people that knew Heath directly.
And some of them were murdered, weren't they?
Possibly.
Some of these kids were murdered. I know, look, there's an old guest who used to come on the programme. Michael, who... People take him with a pinch of salt. Yes, people take him with a big pinch of salt. Half listeners would listen and say, Michael is a bullshitter, everything he says is completely, and then there were people who would say, well, he's a typical, if he did work in the spook circles, he's typical misdirection, misinformation. I always took him with a pinch of salt. But on Heath, he was so fluid, in telling me what he knew about Heath. I thought, well, maybe there's something to it. And then I met some years ago a chap who said he would never come on any radio show. And he said a brother of his, he's convinced, was killed by protection agents around Edward Heath. I think you might know the man I'm talking about, who believes his brother was murdered. This guy now would be in his 50s now. His older brother was murdered on the Morning Cloud. That's how they keep them honest, Tony, isn't it? And can I just say this? So would Victor Rothschild, I'm going to ask you this then. I read an amazing book years ago called The Nazi Roots of the Brussels EU. I think you turned me onto it. And you did turn me onto it. And I interviewed the author of it. Wasn't the European Union basically a result of the failure of the biggest corporations and banks in the world to use Hitler to control Europe? Well, they would control Hitler. They wanted Hitler to succeed, didn't they? And unite Europe under Hitler. But then that they would use Hitler as a puppet to hoover up all the resources, all the money, all the real wealth. And the failure to do this, because the Nazis were defeated, this is where the European Union came out of. Is that fair to say? No doubt.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's Walter Funk, 1941, who was the finance minister under Hitler. He may have just been the president of the Bundesbank. They came up with this plan to, basically it's a financial plan for occupied Europe. once they'd gone into the Low Countries and invaded France, etc. They're saying, well, we need to have a system for financial management. So this is where, in a way, it comes back to Blair and his setting up the Welsh and the Scottish parliaments. The idea is to regionalise the whole of Europe. The United Kingdom is no longer united; it's just separate regions of Brussels, and that we can have this kind of sham elections democracy, but actually at the end of the day the whole thing will be run by the European Commission, which is made up of essentially failed politicians, people that the public have booted out, or else so-called experts who are compliant. So the Fourth Reich, is the easiest way to describe it, is a financial Reich, and it was set up in the 1950s and 1960s, and the political leadership of it was steered by the famous Bilderbergers, who I've looked at so closely, and that was set up by the Central Intelligence Agency, the War and Peace Study Group, as it was the Council on Foreign Relations in the States in World War II, so that the US could dominate the politics of Europe, and they've done that, I think, through the Bilderbergers. But, Britain, if you look at what's happened here since the 1970s through the 80s, is simple, really. Thatcher's privatisation, spearheaded by Victor Rothschild, and actually many of those share flotations of public assets, like telecoms, etc., that took place in the 1980s, were actually run by the Rothschild, the Rothschild Bank would actually manage those share flotations. So don't tell me they weren't intimately involved. Of course they were. And the idea here was that once Thatcher had got rid of exchange controls, that is to say money can flow in and out of the country freely, these industries were privatised, and then you've got foreign entities of all sorts. God knows who it is. In many cases, for example, it's the German railways, the French railways, the French EDF that control now and own much of our infrastructure. And chatting to a gas engineer last year down in Devon somewhere, he was saying, we're all owned by China. So the Chinese and it's anybody around the world that wants to buy up British infrastructure can do so.
Look at Thames Water. Look at Thames Water today. Thames Water, owned by Abu Dhabi, owned by China, and it's owned by pension funds here in the UK, but also overseas. You're bang on. This is vital stuff. I'm only interrupting you because listeners want answers from you.
You're right.
God damn it.
That's bang on today, isn't it? So they're now saying that they're talking about nationalisation. So Starmer has promised the World Economic Forum he'll do no such thing. So don't think you're going to get any nationalisation under Labour. What they'll do, is they'll just bump up the water bills in London, and that's then the shareholders will agree to refinance the company.
You are bang on,
which is the moment isn't profitable, and that will be a way out of it. But it'll be much cheaper and much more sensible and simpler for Britain, for British people, and more democratic if they were to just take it back into public ownership. All they do is wait till the franchise is finished, or they're bankrupt anyway, and the government can legislate, or just it's very, very simple for them to take it over. But of course, the banksters won't want that, and so they'll be making that very clear to their puppet politicians like Goldman Sachs, Rishi Sunak.
I have questions for you from our listeners. You're listening to Tony Gosling, former BBC journalist, author, brilliant books. I will put links to them on the notes later on, and also broadcaster, not the BCFM Politics Show. It's excellent, Fridays at 5:00, and he's also a Costa Coffee toilet rebel these days for his sins.
Deleting my Costa app as we speak. Now, before we talk about the attack in Moscow, because the listener has a question for you about the attack in Moscow, I want to go back to, and you can be as brief as you like here, the devolution promises by the Labour Party to give more power, to cede power from government, as if they have any real power, but to cede the perceived government power and give it to local authorities. Great friends of mine believe the primary reason for this is because they want the local authorities, this is the global to local agenda, to run the climate change bullshit. Is that fair? Okay, so it's fine to give power to local authorities when they're bankrupt because they can't do anything. That's, I think, what really is behind what your listener's saying there. They've got to the point now where the funding for local authorities is so inadequate, so pathetic, that almost whatever power you give to them is ineffective. So yeah, of course, there are a lot of them in Bristol. We've just had the implementation of one of these ridiculous, they put the planters across the road to stop you driving down the street. And of course, this climate agenda is also being used by Siemens, the Nazi electronics company, as it was in World War II, to put all these cameras up everywhere, to put everybody under surveillance. And I'm not sure if it's true. One of my guests was telling me recently that the cameras are also good for facial recognition too. So the idea is just get these cameras everywhere, and turn everything into this massive surveillance state. So the whole climate business, I think, is perfect example of accelerationism. And this term, I think, more and more people are coming to understand how important accelerationism is. My old school friend, I told you, I think a couple of years ago, when I first found out about it, Richie, Nick Land, who's now over in Shanghai, is talked of as the father of accelerationism. So this is a Nietzschean philosophical idea, a bit similar to what David Icke talks about, problem, reaction, solution, but it's actually a much sort of more 4 or 5 dimensional thing than that, where you have a problem, which is quite true. We do have warming around the world generally, particularly in the northern hemisphere. But what they do is they exaggerate it and they come up with a solution which is going to make things worse. And that's what I see don't get bogged down and caught up in trying to argue about temperature going up and down, because it may be going up and down. It may not be mankind that's doing it. It certainly does seem to be rising at the moment in the northern hemisphere. And but what do you do about it? Well, the answer is you renationalise. You start to depend less on your private cars, and you have cheap or free public transport that people can use. When we were kids, we used to just go around on the train up to London, etc., or around on the buses for a few pennies, and everyone just did that because that was the easiest way and by far the cheapest way to get around. But they don't want to come up with solutions like that. They want to come up with market solutions which will allow the rich to get away, with paying no ULEZ because they've got a brand new Discovery, whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, but I think you're both. I think you're. Sorry, T. I think you're both right. I think you're both right and wrong there. If I may be so bold, my friend.
Of course.
I think you're right in what you said there about the rich, but this idea that they could make public transport free, this is planned. I mean, this is happening in France, it's happening in Germany, it's happening in southern France, where entire cities, my missus being French is all over this, are declaring that either now or very soon public transport will be completely free for everybody because they want to get cars off the road. And listen, you've given me the opportunity to flag up a debate. I'm debating a climate change evangelical this coming Tuesday. He's an American guy who hates climate deniers. I've been looking into this more than anything that I've ever looked into over the last 20 years. I believe, just to be very brief here, we are in an interglacial period at the moment. We are still in the most recent ice age. We're emerging from it. We're coming to the end of an 11,500 year cycle. It's probably going to get very cooler real soon. And there's nothing we can do, people, in terms of our CO2 output to drastically alter the climate or the temperature. I've just seen no evidence for it, T. And the solutions, like you've talked about so many years on your own shows and your books, the solutions give a real clue, don't they, as to what might be really going on here. I mean, the climate agenda is really about, as you said, surveillance, restriction on movement, restriction on what you can eat, what you can do, where you can travel, of course. And no, I don't buy it. And I'm an old, as you will, I'm not going to say it again, my listeners will kill me. You know my political background. I used to believe this stuff, this climate change stuff, Tony. I believed it. I swallowed all of this stuff back in the 90s.
I am an environmentalist. I still am. I very much care for the environment. I see it as over Easter time, this is creation we're looking after here. It's very precious, and so let's not poop in our own backyards.
No, but hang on, are you conflating two things? And you shouldn't, because you're too clever for that. You're conflating destroying the environment by polluting it, wrecking the oceans with plastic. These are disgusting things that corporations and globalists and whatnot have been doing for years. But that's got nothing to do with the claim that, CO2 as generated by human existence is changing the climate, or warming the planet. Those are two different issues entirely, right?
Yeah, they are. I mean, it's a conflation of the two. That's what they're trying to get away with.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I think, particularly in Britain, we've got a particular big responsibility because we were the first country on earth to really go for mass urbanization and the Industrial Revolution. And it wasn't that we went for it, it was the elite that went for it. And it was actually, I think, John Dee, if you go back that far in the Elizabethan era, that came up with the plan to build and expand a British Empire around the world. I mean, he was basing it in a way on the old ancient Phoenician Empire, and Carthage, which was the big Phoenician port that they built up on the southern Mediterranean. And the basis of their power was, number one, is in secrecy, and that's, I think, what we managed to get away with quite a lot through Freemasonry and other sort of secret societies in the West, but also through very powerful projection of naval power. So the Phoenicians on the Mediterranean, anybody that built a ship basically and started to sail around the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians would first of all be very friendly and nice to them, find out who they were, and then they would ram their ships and sink them. And that was, in a way, the sort of attitude of the Royal Navy in the 1800s, was the Navy. But they weren't just doing it in the Mediterranean. The Royal Navy were doing it in the whole world. So that's why I think in Britain we've got this big response, because we've got these massive cities like Manchester. I think Keir Starmer was in Birmingham or near Birmingham today, launching his local election manifesto. And these cities have just lost their purpose to be there. So we are the people who have got to come out with solutions and understand, how is it that an industrial society comes out of being an industrial society and starts to become an easy place. There was an article in The Guardian last week talking about Britain's housing, saying it's the worst value anywhere in the developed world.
That's right.
And what you're going to find, of course, you're not going to find such good housing in many ways in the heart of Africa or whatever, but it's cheap. And what we're doing is we've got rubbish housing here in Britain, pretty awful housing, and the new houses that have been built are like little shoeboxes. It's massively, massively expensive. It's overpriced partly because of the migration and the massive demand that there is for new housing. But also simply because that's the way that people make money in Britain now. It's through monopolising, controlling infrastructure and just jacking the price up because they can, by price fixing. And so I think we've really got to find a way to redistribute land. I mean, we've done it before in the past where people have had rents converted into their own ownership and mortgages. In fact, the Irish did that in the 1800s. With the success of the Irish Land League. And in many ways, that was the reason why Britain finally had to give up Ireland. Okay, there was a lot of fighting involved, but, because we weren't actually squeezing so much rent out of the Irish, the English weren't anyway, the absentee landowners, then there was far more money was staying in Ireland. The people had a little bit more time. They had the energy and the wealth to get themselves a bit organised. I'm not saying they were wealthy, but they weren't having to be in this horrific rack renting situation where they were living in utter poverty and all of the money they produced was going back to England. So I think we need to look at learn lessons from the Irish Land League of the 1880s. And what happened there was the people basically were paying rent, and they were given these very, very cheap interest government loans to buy their own plot. So you imagine if you're in a rented house or in a rented flat, to buy your own place. And actually you end up paying as interest on those loans far less than you were on the old rents. So we need to find a way of just stop. And I think another good thing to do would be to just criminalise eviction. So to make sure that people don't feel that they're threatened to be forced out of their home in this current situation. We've got in Bristol, we've got a fourfold increase in the number of people living in vans over the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, this is, everybody is finding the same problem, but what we need to do, I think, is talk through and enact some of the solutions to the housing crisis, because it's at the root of the cost of living crisis.
Tony, these are some of the best.
People's income is going on mortgages and rent.
These are some of the best solutions I've heard for a long time. I've known you since my days in Spain. I never had you down as a fan of Charles Stewart Parnell. I can't believe it. I might not do another radio show ever again after this. I'll never wash my hands again, Tony. The great Tony Gosling extolling the virtues of Michael Davitt and Charles Stewart Parnell. Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic,
so
yeah.
wonderful. So how could it work then? Because you won't get a politician in this country to support it. I love the idea. Let's say that every family in this country, let's put race and all of that bollocks to one side, excuse my language. Let's say that every family in this country should have by human right, a certain amount of acres for themselves to own, to build on, and we'll help you do that. How would that work, T? Would it be like you said, the Land League back home, whereby, right, you will have to pay for it. We can't give it to you for nout, but we'll do it through exceptionally low interest loans that
That's
your
right.
family, and maybe not even you, maybe your sons, maybe your daughters might pay back in the future. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's two sides to all of this. One is the obscene amount of land that some individual families and individuals own, and of course companies and corporations. That would be another thing. You could just simply make it unlawful for a company to own land. That land had to be owned by individuals. So what you do is you find all those really big estates like the Duke of Westminster, Duke of Buccleuch, and you target those. You would requisition them, maybe compensate them, maybe not. Really depends on the politics of the day. But you certainly have to have that debate. And then redistribute some of that. Obviously, a lot of it is, up on a hill with a rock, and it's not a good place to live. But a very good model for that sort of land holding is the crofting system, where you have a bit of land on a hill and you also have a croft, which, by the way, a croft in Scotland, the lowland crofts is probably the easiest thing to have a look at. But they're also Highland crofts. They are passed on through the family, so you can't buy and sell them. So you can't get a bank loan against your, with your home as security, because the bank can't sell it. It can only go to people within your family, or be decided by the crofting committee. So this is an old-fashioned way of dealing with land. So it's not just a sort of commodity like a car or a plate or a screwdriver that you can buy and sell at will. But the other side of it is what I was saying just now, which is stopping evictions, just making sure that the people who are already in homes which are owned by the banks or by private landlords, that there is a transition between where they are, them paying rent or mortgage or whatever it is they're paying, to the situation where they own their own place through. As it was at Parnell organised. In fact, it was, you know what it was? It was Irish MPs held the balance of power at Westminster, and that's how they managed to squeeze this deal out of them. And there was horrific poverty over there as well. So the papers were going on and on about how terribly, poverty-stricken, disease-stricken Ireland was. And of course, we're getting to the same sort of thing with food banks in Britain now, with so many people reliant, even people in work reliant on food banks. So these are the sorts of structural things, I think, particularly to do with land. And then, of course, you've got to address the money system too, if you're going to make any real difference. So that is to say, you have to have a government controlled bank of some sort. So, I mean, obviously this particular elected government would be useless. But to see banking as a utility, a public utility, and also to make sure that all taxes are on the wealthy. So things like bread don't get taxed. A small, modest car, maybe an older car, doesn't get taxed. The really expensive modern ones do. And we've seen now the implementation of these new clean air zone type charges, where the most expensive 50, 70, 80,000 pound cars aren't taxed at all. Whereas something that you've bought for 500-600 quid, that is taxed, and they use this excuse of climate for that. So there are all sorts of changes, but I think money and land, if you can actually start addressing those two, then there is light at the end of the tunnel, and we can be, I think, the first country maybe to come out of the industrial era and to start and maybe become a sort of semi-rural economy with people growing more of their own food, that sort of thing. In fact, in Bristol, I could announce we've just had a fantastic victory with our allotment holders in Bristol. Thousands of them across the city were being told, no, you can't keep livestock. No, you can't have trees on your allotment. No, you can't have community groups using the allotment. all these sorts of horrific restrictions put in there by, it looked like by, PricewaterhouseCoopers or KPMG trying to monetize the Bristol's allotments. And we just had the announcement today. No, that's not happening. They've completely kicked the whole thing back. So the allotment tiers have totally won.
That's brilliant.
And everything is on hold now for another year or so, and they're going to have a proper look at it and a proper consultation.
The world we live in, Tony, doesn't belong to anybody. It belongs to nobody, and we're on it for a short time. Every human being, I've said this my entire life, I've only ever really had one political hero, and that's Salvador Allende. I loved him, even though he was dead before I was born. And later on, Chavez. This is beautiful. Every person, every family on this planet is entitled to some land, to cultivate and to build a place to live on. I can't believe you brought up Parnell, as a student of history myself and as somebody who knows his own history. It was back on the 21st of October, 1879. I'm not going to lie. I'm not doing this from memory. I've just dragged this up now. They met in Castlebar in Mayo. Charles Stewart Parnell stood up and he proclaimed that the Land League would bring about a reduction of rack rents to facilitate the obtaining of the ownership of the soil by the occupiers, and that this would be best attained by promoting organisation among the tenant farmers, by defending those who may be threatened with eviction for refusing to pay unjust rents. And you can substitute the Irish tenant farmers of the late 19th century. You can substitute Irish tenant farmers with the people of Britain or the people of Ireland or the people of France. But will you ever get enough cooperation amongst people, do you think? Because I think people have never been so divided, identity politics and everything else, as they are now. Because this would require huge mobilisation, wouldn't it, of people to come together?
Well, I don't know about people being divided, actually. I think people are becoming more united against what they can see as a kind of tyranny coming in. I mean, look at the two-party state that's supposedly giving us some sort of choice in the election. The other thing, of course, is the support for this genocide is universally bringing people together across the country. So, I mean, we've got, for example, an anti-apartheid, Bristol apartheid-free zone thing, which has been kicking off in Bristol against the Israelis. They've got one in Cardiff as well. So ordinary people are coming together in a way to show their disgust for the way that, the insulting way in which the country's being run. The Irish you're right, the Irish have sort of showed the way there. And I just think it's, brilliant to see some of the results of that. I mean, if people haven't visited Ireland much, when I was over there, the country people there was lots of small holdings. It wasn't like the big farms in England. And the people have the time of day to spend to chat with you. And that, to me, is what it's all about. You see all these people in England just running around, trying desperately to pay all the bills, and then realizing sometimes they can't, trying to pay the childcare bills, having to weigh up, oh no, am I going to be able to go to work to make the money to pay the rent? But then if I do that, then it's almost all my wages is going in other costs, in transport costs, in childcare costs. And this is a game they're playing with. I think we just have to tear it up and say, no, we're not having this game anymore. Everyone is in that one together. They do try and divide and rule. I realise that. But even that seems to be falling apart now when we look at the horrific, the support for this mass murder in Gaza and for the Israelis. And even the Israelis are now calling the United Nations anti-Semitic. They're beyond a joke. So I think there is a raising of consciousness going on by the more extreme measures that our governments are taking against us. And, of course, the corporations hanging around in the background who are really, I think, coming up with these policies. The government is just bending over and doing what they're told.
On what's happening in Gaza, from the UK point of view, look, I have to be fair. I would ordinarily echo pretty much everything you said, but I've got to be fair, right? Maybe I'm wrong. Am I wrong? I would say I don't see a rise in anti-Semitism against Jewish people in the UK based on what's happening in Gaza. But I've had emails and messages from people who, they say, Richie, I'm awake to what's going on. I don't support what's happening in Gaza. Most Jewish people don't. But there has been a rise in thuggishness in some places and outlandish behaviour towards Jewish people. Is there? Do you see or hear about any of that in Bristol or in London?
Well, I see no real anti-Semitism really much. Not certainly having a go at people because they're Jewish. Many of the Jewish people, of course, like Alexei Sale and the rest, have been on the demonstrations, against the Israelis. But what I do see is anti-Christian behaviour. I mean, we've got a pastor, Dia Moodley, in Bristol, whose Spirit of Life Church in Lochleys is a Reformed Baptist church. He's a very gutsy guy. He's the sort of guy I've got him on my show this week talking about it. But he gets up on a little ladder and he talks about abortion. He talks about all these things. Actually, a lot of them are sort of Catholic style things that the Protestants seem to kind of brush under the carpet. He talks about genocide. He talks about the excesses of feminism. It's all sorts of contentious subjects that he gets his teeth into. But anyway, the fact is, last Thursday, he was pushed off of his ladder by some young women students from the university and quite badly injured his hand. And they were just jeering at him. And this is at least what I've heard, although I think he may have been, he was arrested and he was charged with saying that the Allah was a false god, and you're not allowed to say that during Ramadan, according to the police. The university, he was outside the Bristol University up on Queen's Road, and so I see anti-Christianity. That's what I see, and that's nothing to do with the war necessarily, but it's being ignored. There's a lot of talk about Islamophobia, a lot of talk about anti-Semitism. I hear nothing about what's happened to Dia Moodley, and he was reported, by the way, his initial agreement that he supposedly had with the police, which the police now seem to have broken, that was reported on Fox News in the States. It was reported in the Daily Mail, all over the Christian press throughout the world. But it wasn't reported in Bristol, Richie. Nobody in Bristol, none of the news outlets, ITV, BBC, Bristol 24/7, or the Bristol Post, none of them reported it at all.
I knew nothing about it until you mentioned it. I knew nothing of this. I want to go back to something, though, to be fair now, T, right?
All right.
Not every Jewish person who says, I've been screamed at or threatened by somebody who's hyper, wound up by what's going on in Gaza. Not every Jewish person who claims this is lying. I spoke to the historian Andrew Barr yesterday. Andrew's a top lad. He's Jewish. We talked about this. He's no fan of what's going on in Gaza. He talked about how, Zionists have, for many times over the years, have thrown Jews to the wolves, sacrificed Jews, for their greater aims, in expanding, the state of Israel. Very good historian. Look, there is some stuff. It can't, because it's so polarized these days, everything is. We can't say that there's not some abuse coming the way of Jewish people. I'm not saying it's, endemic or that it's institutional, but with everything that's going on, it's only fair to say there must be some, they're not all lying, T.
No, look, the whole point is to divide the Islam and Judaism, and that's the aim. The idea is to get a third world war started in the Middle East between Iran and Israel, and that seems to be the motive. And this is one of the reasons the Israelis are just not interested in peace, is because they've got a war agenda and they intend to drag the Americans in on their side in that war, if there's any problems, which there almost certainly would be for the existence of the Israeli state. So that's what they're after. And the point of all of that, I think you have to go back to, for me, the only way I can really rationalize it is going back to the Freemason, Scottish Rite Freemason Grand Master Albert Pike, whose letter, allegedly anyway, this letter then disappeared apparently from the British Library, talks about, published in 1871, talks about three world wars. Well, if you look at the First World War, you can see the British kind of pushed the Ottomans out of the Holy Land. In the Second World War, there was the creation of the State of Israel, which, by the way, always was the object of the Knights Templar, who were created in medieval times by the Vatican, and to take over the real estate of the Holy Land and to turn it into hell. Now, his object in all of this, these three world, it was difficult to think in these long, sort of hundreds of years time. But why not? Why not have a plan that lasts a long time, that various generations are trying to implement bit by bit? the whole point of it was to create such a horrific conflict, a Third World War, based around religion in the Middle East. So particularly the clash of Islam and Israel, that everybody would be fed up with religion. Religion could be blamed for this massive world war, and that they would bring in their Luciferian agenda. That was his in his writings. That's what he talks about. So basically, we could have this nice Luciferian world where the ego, which is what Luciferian is really about, it's about people who think that they are gods, that the egotistical Luciferians can then sort of take over. We can sweep away all of this nonsense about God, the monotheistic faiths, Judaism, the Bible, all this stuff, and then we can take over the world. So it's a bit like Dr. No, world domination, same old dream. And that's what I see going on. And that's why I think you've got so much of a polarization between the Jews and the Muslims, is because they're getting quite close to finishing off their little Albert Pike plan from 1871.
I've got about 500 messages to read, and I've only got 10 minutes to do it. So for today, and today only, we will part company. But before we do that, Tony's on air tomorrow at 5. He's written 2 brilliant books, The Siege of Heaven, How Breaking the Grip of Oligarchy Will Unleash the World's Human Potential, and The Traitors of Arnhem, Martin Bormann and the Bilderberg Group Origins. Everything we've been talking about today is referenced in these books, and I recommend you buy them strongly. So before I read these messages, last thing to say to you, pal, is Happy Easter. Thanks for coming on today. It was an education as always, and I'm so made up that you know your Irish history, although I shouldn't be surprised.
No, I mean, there's a lot of, it's not in Scotland, the clearances too, that was in the 1880s as well. I mean, but if you're looking at Easter, this is, I think, a really good test. It's Passover this year, not every year, but this year, and I think next year and last year, you've got Ramadan falling in the same time as Passover and Easter. So let's look, this is the test for Ben Gvir, for Smotrich, and for Netanyahu, is let's have a look. Just how really Old Testament are you? Just how really 10 Commandments are you? Just how much do you read the Bible? Do you believe the Bible? We will tell by your actions over this Easter, over this Passover. We will know by looking at the way you behave.
Tony, thanks again for today. Happy Easter, buddy. We'll speak real soon. Speak in April.
Thanks, Richie.
And I look forward to the programme tomorrow. I'll be listening tomorrow, 5 o'clock Fridays, not at the BCFM Politics Show, thisweek.org.uk. Follow Tony Gosling on Twitter as well. There's only one Tony Gosling. That's real. There is only one, but there's only one Tony Gosling on Twitter. Check him out there. Thanks to him. Now then, to your messages, and a lot of them came in. I couldn't stop to read them because time was pressing. Devolution, look at the dictionary definition. To make things worse, to de-evolve. It's not a good look for the average man, says Baron von Lotzov. Thank you so much for that. Hi to Kaz, who says, Richie, Z buses are free in Hereford City. You see, Tony? Absolutely, Kaz. That's coming. No doubt about it.